the Russians have miscalculated with these flights of their drones and airplanes over NATO territory. I think they wanted to scare the West, or they wanted to create division. But it looks to me now that rather these violations of NATO territory have now, or it looks for now, I mean, this is all very preliminary. For now, it looks as if they have actually reunited the Euro-Atlantic alliance.
Today I'm joined by Andreas Umland, an analyst at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for joining me.
Finally.
So last night at Trump's trip to the UN and his speech, he made a sharp turn in his rhetoric towards Russia and its invasion of Ukraine, ridiculing Putin in the process and throwing support behind the full recovery of Ukrainian territory. Who or what do we have to thank for this change in tone? And how was Trump's mind changed, do you think?
First of all, it's a pleasant surprise to have this radical turn in the rhetoric of Trump. Second, we have to wait what this actually means. Maybe it's just a rhetorical turn. If it will not have any material consequences, then we may as well ignore it. But if it will have material consequences, then, of course, this question is very justified. I guess we will have to wait for the historians and for the archives to open to fully get to know what happened. I think one of the factors is probably simply American public opinion, where we've seen in the last year not only not a decline of support for Ukraine and a critical approach to Russia and in particular to Putin, but even a rise of the support among the electorate for American help for Ukraine, and even among Republican voters. We had an upturn, and all of that happened in spite of a massive pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian, I would say, propaganda campaign in the ultra-conservative American media, where even people like Alexander Dugin, a rabid Russian imperialist and fascist, has now become prominent. And in spite of all of that, we have now this public opinion. And perhaps a second factor is also the influence of the Western partners, of the partners within Europe, of the US. I think that is not so important, or I suspect it's not so important for Trump, but certainly these partners, they also have a certain influence, and perhaps not so much on Trump himself, but on the Republican Party and on the think tanks, the intellectuals, the politicians that are in the Republican Party or close to the Republican Party.
So then do you think this is potentially being well received in America, given offering, for example, guarantees in the event of peace between Russia and Ukraine is, arguably getting involved in foreign wars, which Trump specifically stood on the platform of not doing?
As far as I understood so far, these American investments, so to say, in Ukrainian security, they are going to be only indirect, and indirect firstly in the sense that apparently there will be no direct help, actually. That will be just, let's say, weaponry sold to Ukraine. Maybe there is actually and there will be some direct help in terms of information provided by American satellites, American special services, so that indeed this information could be counted as a direct help. But most of the material help will apparently be simply sold to Ukraine for presumably European money. And second, the security guarantees are in any way a complicated issue, because they will only kick in after a stable ceasefire has started. And currently, actually, the announcement of the security guarantees and the readiness of West European countries to send troops to Ukraine is preventing a ceasefire. And so this is a slightly paradoxical situation we have now, because Putin does not want these Western troops on American soil. But in any way, I don't think American troops will actually participate in that, or at least not in a significant way. I think what Trump or what America will and should be doing here is to reassure those countries, especially in Central Eastern Europe, the member countries of NATO, that if they go forward and help more actively Ukraine, that they themselves will be secure from a Russian attack, and that the American security guarantee within NATO is still upheld, and that in a direct way only the US would be providing a security guarantee for NATO member countries that in their turn will be helping Ukraine, perhaps also with troops on Ukrainian ground. But as far as I understand, the US is not providing directly security guarantees, although it has already provided so-called security assurances in the now infamous 1994 Budapest Memorandum in connection with Ukraine's accession to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this American role here is very indirect, but still it's important. I think for the European countries, it will be extremely important that they can still rely on NATO, that they can rely on the US for the protection of NATO territory.
As you suggest, Trump is not known for his consistency, certainly in this field. Do you think this change in rhetoric represents a deeper change of mind in Trump, or just a shift in negotiation tactics?
That's difficult to say. We will see what comes out of that. In any way, that he has voiced that now, and he has put it in writing, that is already positive. And I think it will be, if he does not actually then fulfill the promise that he made, be a problem for him. So he has already come out to a certain degree. But you're right. I mean, we will see then only as time goes on what that actually means and how serious that is. And I wouldn't even exclude that he may once again turn around 180 degrees and start supporting Russia again, because I think it doesn't come really from his heart. I don't think that is really something that he was very keen on doing. But now I think his domestic situation is such that he needs this sort of boost from supporting Ukraine, which is, as I mentioned, popular, not just popular among the American population, but also popular among many Republican voters. And as far as I've learned, even among MAGA, that is something that is not maybe as popular as in the rest of the American population, but also something that is supported. And I think actually the Russians have miscalculated with these flights of their drones and airplanes over NATO territory. I think they wanted to scare the West, or they wanted to create division. But it looks to me now that rather these violations of NATO territory have now, or it looks for now, I mean, this is all very preliminary. For now, it looks as if they have actually reunited the Euro-Atlantic alliance.
Important.
So you think that these airspace incursions are in some ways, maybe not the whole thing that has brought Trump to this position, but is part of what has brought Trump to this position now?
Who knows? I would think in an indirect way, certainly in that it has very much alerted the European NATO member countries, and they have probably communicated their fears to the White House and to the State Department, and then it has reached Trump. I suspect that Trump doesn't really care about whether there are drones in Poland or over Estonia, and I even wonder how much he would care if it turns out that the drones in Denmark were Russian, and it looks like there were. But these sort of the tensions within the Western alliance, they play a role. But one should also not forget is that, of course, these European countries, at least the Central East European countries, they have a certain influence on the American electorate, on the diaspora from these countries in the US. And so that is also maybe here an electoral factor that is playing into all of this.
What do you make of Trump greenlighting the downing of Russian military aircraft that crosses into NATO airspace? I mean, surely this seems like normal operating procedure, but having the backing of Trump, I think, is not something that we were all expecting.
Yeah, I mean, that is, as you rightly say, that is actually what NATO is about. So one shouldn't be surprised. But it's to be welcomed that Trump has made this also now clear that he stands behind this NATO agreement, and that that the US is not out of it, as it looked several times over the last 8 months. There were lots of doubts how much actually the US is still a part, not just formally, but also really and materially a part of NATO. But these signals now are indicating that the US, for the time being at least, remains a full member of NATO.
So what actions need to be taken next to sort of convince Putin that Trump isn't having a change of heart later on, or he's just saying what he wants to say at the moment, and he might, like you say, go back to Russia at some another point in the future?
As I indicated, material action, deeds, not just words. I think that is now the important thing here. And I would also argue that at the end of the day, this argument about this is all a European matter, it makes sense at a first glance. That, of course, the European countries, the European NATO members, should first of all care about Ukraine and not the North American. But one should not remember that the US played a major role in the early 1990s in the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine, and the continental European member countries did not play a role in this. In fact, the original trilateral negotiations for the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine were only between Ukraine, the US, and Russia, and nobody else. And then was involved, and then Great Britain also signed the Budapest Memorandum, but it didn't actually, even Great Britain didn't take part in these negotiations that led to the nuclear disarmament. And this nuclear disarmament in the early 1990s was very much in the national interest of the US, because the intercontinental missiles on Ukrainian soil, they were programmed during Soviet times to hit American cities, not European, US cities. And that's why there was such a high interest for getting rid of them, which one can understand. But this full nuclear disarmament of Ukraine has, of course, prepared this war. It has created this disbalance between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has nuclear weapons. Ukraine does not have nuclear weapons. And this is actually, I would say, one of the major facts about this entire war, and how that is why everybody behaves like they are behaving. Ukraine is behaving the way it behaves because it does not have nuclear weapons. Russia behaves the way it behaves because Russia has nuclear weapons, and Ukraine does not have them. And all other partners are also, whether the Russian partners or the Ukrainian partners, they are very much, their behavior is very much guided by this fundamental fact of Ukraine being a non-nuclear weapon state and Russia being a nuclear weapon state.
And so you mentioned deeds would be the thing, action taken by Trump and his administration in support of Ukraine. But what would these deeds be? What would the support actually look like? It's hard to figure out what Trump would agree to at this point.
At the current point, I would just say that basically the support that Ukraine is still receiving from the US should be continued. That means the provision of information from the battleground about Russia received via satellites and special services and so on. And also the sale of weapons to Ukraine should be without any restrictions, neither in terms of the quantity and quality of the weaponry, but also without any restrictions of the use then of these weapons. And as I indicated when I mentioned the Budapest Memorandum and the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine, one would also hope that the US would actually provide weapons that it may not need anymore to Ukraine for free. Maybe not the most recent ones, but I could imagine that there's a lot of American weaponry that is going to be replaced with more newer arms and equipment, and then the still operational older weaponry could be simply transferred to Ukraine, and that would be a lot, or could be a lot, I suspect.
And so, what do you think Putin will do next in the face of this shift from Trump? We've seen, obviously, them say that this was a big mistake and these sort of things from the Kremlin, but what will be Putin's next actions in response to this?
I guess there's now confusion in Russia, and they are probably asking themselves the same questions that you have been posing. You know, what does it all mean? And as I said, I'm not yet sure that it really will eventually mean that much. I guess they will be for now waiting what that actually means, whether this is just maybe something done for the domestic audience, or that is just for public relations reasons for the European partners of the US, some sort of positive signal without any real consequences. But if it does indicate a shift in Trump's approach, he has even indicated that Ukraine could go further than restoring its territory. That is certainly popular with some people in Ukraine, maybe not so much with the European partners. But if this new approach really will mean something, then I think Putin has a problem. I think he will then even go closer to the authoritarian partners, to North Korea, Iran, China. That will be then his way. But that is also all not so easy, because these alliances are problematic also, and China is supporting Russia, but I wonder how much it is at the end of the day really engaged in it and actually ready to invest and maybe also to take risk for Russia. One would have to ask a China expert on that. My feeling is that they calibrate very much their support for Russia.
This led me a little bit onto my next question, which is, what do you make of Zelensky's timely speech in which he makes the point China has been silent in its opposition to the war, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And do you think that was potentially something that Zelensky and Trump discussed, sort of shifting the invasion of Ukraine to also be part of the conflict, or growing conflict, between America and China?
Whether there was a sort of coordination between Kiev and Washington on this, I don't know. Again, we may have to wait for the archives to open and the historians to research that. But that, I think, was a smart move, and it's also very much justified to do so by Ukraine, because it got also a statement in 1994 when the Budapest Memorandum was signed. Ukraine got a statement from the then Chinese government that the Chinese government respects the borders and the sovereignty of Ukraine. That was then given because China is also an official nuclear weapons state. France also provided then such a statement as another official nuclear weapons state. So China is also under obligation, and there is, most people don't know that there is actually a fully ratified friendship treaty between Ukraine and China, signed in 2013 under President Yanukovych, but then ratified not only by Ukraine, but also by China when after the Euromaidan revolution, the revolution of dignity, when Poroshenko was already president, and when Ukraine had made its, or finalized, I would say, its turn to the West, China ratified this friendship treaty. And in this friendship treaty, there's a long article about sovereignty, territorial integrity, inviolability of borders. So China is also under obligation here to actually deliver to what it has agreed, both in in 1994 in connection with the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine, and in the Friendship Treaty, and in other forms as well. As a member of the Security Council of the UN, for instance, China is also obliged to help Ukraine to preserve its borders and integrity and sovereignty. So that is a very valid and good move by Zelensky. My feeling was also that the formulation was very cautious. It was not to offend China, but it was a sort of a question towards Beijing, and very well put and very justified.
And so I'm going to ask you to make a prediction here of where do you see the conflict in Ukraine going now? The incursions of NATO airspace, will those cease to be happening? And I think the prediction of where a lot of us thought maybe this conflict was going is very different today than it was yesterday before we heard Trump speak about Ukraine and Russia.
I hope you are right. I hope this is really now a turning point, maybe a Zeitenwende even of the American foreign policy. We had this term introduced by former Chancellor Scholz in February 2022 after the large-scale invasion started. Zeitenwende means a change of times, a change of epochs, of a new era, so to say. Hopefully that is indeed the start of a new era of Ukrainian-US relations, of US-European relations, perhaps also a new era for Russian-US relations. So if that is indeed then the case, that's a good sign for Ukraine. And my suspicion is also that this could, if really the elite in Moscow gets the impression that this is serious, it's not just talk, this could also change the calculations in the Kremlin. There will be now many people, or could be then many people in Moscow who think, well, if the Americans are now fully on the side of Ukraine again, and that is then a war that cannot be won, and then perhaps we will also have a new approach by the Russian leadership. But that's very difficult to predict. And again, we mentioned that already. A lot will also depend on how China reacts to all of this. Also, the Europeans themselves are here, of course, very important actors. How much will they get their act together and can mobilize funds for Ukraine and weaponry and so on? A lot depends here actually now on the European partners of Ukraine.
Andreas Umland, thank you for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me.